Shabbat Shalom. And Shabbat Shalom to everyone on Zoom. I can't hear you answer, but I'm sure you've just answered. Permit me to take a book off the bookshelf. So Gershom Scholem, the pioneering scholar of Kabbalah who wrote this massive tome on Shabbetai Zevi, the 17th century failed Messiah, said that Judaism is defined not by just what the sort of traditional elites say it is, but by what Jews were actually doing. And that's true in biblical period, in the Talmudic period, certainly true today. And it was true in the case of Shabbetai Zevi as well. Curious how many people have heard of this failed or false Messiah? All right, almost a large majority. Shabbetai Zevi is known perhaps as a quote-unquote false Messiah, but really I want to kind of reclaim him as a foreparent of both of Jewish renewal specifically and of a kind of more liberated Judaism in general. And it's not my invention. Gershom Scholem did the same thing. I'm now going to read all 700 pages of this volume. I will not do that. My interest in Shabbetai Zevi, so I wrote a book on a successor to Shabbetai Zevi, Jacob Frank. And Shabbetai Zevi is a fascinating figure. He started out as kind of an itinerant rabbi, but not a rabbi like with a congregation, just a teacher who went from place to place, and he was discovered by a well-known Kabbalist, Rabbi Nathan of Gaza, who became his kind of publicist and really brought him to a much wider audience. He did have a fairly large following. It's estimated at the height of his popularity, almost 1/3 of European Jews thought he might be, in fact, the Messiah. In 1666, the movement had grown to get the attention of the Ottoman Sultan. This is where he was active in the Ottoman Empire. And at this moment, Shabbatai's followers thought he was going to seize the crown of the Sultan and restore Jewish sovereignty to the land of Israel, as the Messiah was meant to do. That did not happen. He was given the choice to convert or die, and he chose to convert. And this was the end of Sabbateanism as a mass movement. However, as an underground movement, it continues until this very day. In present-day Turkey, there are descendants of those who followed Shabbetai Zevi into a false conversion to Islam and lived outwardly as Muslims and secretly as heretical Messianic Jews, not in the current sense of Messianic Jews. One of the reason I'm talking about this on Pride Shabbat, one of the features of this movement was a kind of radical destabilization of gender norms and what was understood as traditional sexual morality. So people were always having all kinds of sex, right? That's just how it was. But particularly propertied, privileged men were having all kinds of sex. But many of those practices were regarded as sinful or put on the side or secret and only available to the few. The Sabbatean movement was the first movement that had both a kind of ethos of sexual liberation in the context of the Messianic age. Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, had promised that in the age of the Mashiach, the rules governing sexual morality would be either eliminated or loosened. Not sexual morality in terms of ethics, but sexual morality in terms of whether it's okay to have different kinds of sexual relations in different kinds of contexts. That was actually fulfilled, and also, as part of that project, the Sabbatean movement was the first time in Jewish history that women had both temporal and spiritual power, both as spiritual leaders and as leaders materially of communities. So there's a lot to unpack there that I find really interesting. I want to spend about 7 minutes on 3 layers of what I see as the kind of queering of these boundaries. And I have a definition. I'm going to do a very ornery thing, which is that you all got a handout. Those who didn't get it, you could raise your hand and someone will bring it to you. And I'm not going to read much from the handout, which is very ornery. But it's there because I don't want to spend time in my short time that I have with you defining this term queering. It's right there on the piece of paper. So there were 3 of these levels, I think, of destabilization or questioning of sex and gender norms within Judaism that distinguished this Messianic movement. And at the end, by the way, I'll say what it has to do with us today, other than the fact that it's Pride and it's just really interesting and great to recover some queer ancestors. So in a sense, the Sabbatean movement was the most homoerotic in Jewish history, in that the male followers of Shabbetai Zevi sang hymns to his beauty in extremely vivid terms. And these hymns we have today, they have found their way down to us. But not quite, because Shabtai Tzvi's own gender identity was not entirely male. Here, I want to be careful not to project back our categories, either of non-binary gender or of transgender, onto something in the 17th century. But what we can say is that it was certainly not normative. Shabtai Tzvi saw himself as having a female soul. And so when the men are praising his beauty, they're praising her beauty, in a sense. Or we might say, they didn't say, we might say their beauty. Shabtai also understood himself to be kind of the incarnation of Malchut, the Shekhinah, the divine feminine. And so when we greet the Sabbath queen, on Friday nights, and we talk about the Shekhinah, that was embodied in this messianic figure, who was both male and female, and thus kind of neither. Shabtai Tzvi also identified with the biblical Esther, who secretly had her secret mission, which involved, I don't know if anyone's thought about this on Purim, a lot of transgression, right? I mean, she's kind of married into a harem to the non-Jewish king. That's not what I learned in Sunday school. And Shabtai Tzvi saw himself as kind of an incarnation of Esther. So it's unclear exactly how he would have understood his own gender. We would say today he was assigned male at birth and actually did father children with his wife, I'll speak about in just a moment. And here we get to a kind of complexity in dealing with these sources. There are a number of sources which claim that Shabtai Tzvi and also one of his followers, Baruch Yaruso, had sexual relations with some of their male followers. But this is what's so frustrating about studying the losers of history, right? Because history is written by the victors. And we don't know if that was true or if that was a calumny, if that was sort of a nasty rumor that was spread about the movement by their opponents. So today we might say, well, that's great, Shabtai Tzvi, bisexual messiah. But we don't know if that was actually true or, again, if that was just a nasty rumor. And this happens again and again. So that's the first layer, this sort of non-normative gender identity of the Messiah. And this was seen as part of the Messiah's messianic mission, was that this figure would embody both male and female and neither, and that was part of what would be the liberation of Judaism and of the world. Second, I spoke earlier just about women holding positions of power. Interestingly, within the movement, so folks who know the Jewish community know well, why they find a Jewish guy in a desert island and he's built 2 synagogues, and they ask him why he did that, and he says, that's the one I go to, and that's the one I won't be caught dead in. This was true of the Sabbatean movement as well, just as it is of Jewish renewal. There was a strain in the Messianic movement led by Nathan of Gaza, which was somewhat ascetic, right? Meaning renunciatory, certainly renunciation of sensual pleasure. And there was another kind of camp within the movement led by Shabtai Tzvi's wife, Sarah Ashkenazi, who rejected that asceticism and was probably the person most responsible both for the shift in sexual ethics and in women holding positions of power. And in the quote, the second quote that's on the source sheet, Ada Rappaport Alpert, one of my teachers, the late Ada Rappaport Alpert, has, I think, a really insightful quote that some of the sort of nasty rumors that these are all quote unquote loose women or that they have loose sexual morality may actually have been a response or a way of criticizing the empowerment that women in this movement actually had. So there again, it may or may not be true. Right? We know some of the stuff we know is not true. So Sarah Ashkenazi was rumored to have been a sex worker before she married Shabtai Tzvi, which again, in 2024, we might say, well, that's kind of awesome, right? Sex worker brought into the... But at the time that was said, that was seen to be very negative, right? That was said by the movement's opponents. So we don't actually know if that was true or if it was not. But we do know that she had leadership in the movement, and we do know that she was one of many who had leadership in the movement. Chaya Shor, Shundel Dobrushka, Eva Frank, these are some of the names of the Sabbatean women who held political and spiritual power. I want to suggest that this transformation of gender roles was itself a form of queering in a sense, right? What could a woman do? Right? What does it mean to be a woman in a Jewish community? And this was 250 years before the Reform movement would later institute hesitant egalitarianism at around the turn of the 20th century. So this was well in advance of that happening. And it does seem that a lot of the later reading of the Shabtai of the Shabtai Zevi movement, that these are a bunch of kind of sex fiends or sex maniacs, was actually a response to these changes, which I think we would obviously endorse and support. Third, Sabbatean ideology is constantly pushing against certain binaries and certain boundaries. One of those binaries is the binary between the sexual and the spiritual. We do know, rumors notwithstanding, that there were sexual rituals that took place among some Sabbatean communities at specific times, at specific places. One of these is known as the Festival of the Lamb, happens around Passover, and there are documents which the movement themselves, the adherents said that this was true, that people who were not married would have kind of a ritual sexual such sexual activity in a ritual context. And it was also true that there was a lot more range in terms of what was permissible at that time. But it was not seen as like a kind of, I mean, not that there's anything wrong with, you know, just an orgy, but it was seen as actually part of the enactment of the messianic experience. When you, if you imagine, as the Reb Zalman quote on the sheet indicates, if you imagine yourself in a traditional society in the 17th century, imagine the kind of powerful, spiritual, disruptive force that this antinomian, that is deliberately transgressing a law for the sake of a higher religious or spiritual purpose. Imagine the impact that that might have psychologically. This defined the sect, and which at that time was after the Shabbatai's conversion, was living outwardly as Muslims, which relatedly is another of the boundaries that is constantly, the binaries that's constantly questioned in this movement, the binary between Judaism and Islam. Early Sabbateanism clearly borrowed from Sufism. This is again in the Ottoman Empire, present-day Turkey. And later Sabbateans who were outwardly Muslim actually became leaders of some Muslim communities. In fact, later, much later, this community, which is called sometimes the Derma, that's sort of a derogatory term meaning like turncoats or like traitors, basically. The Derma called themselves Ma'aminim, believers. The Ma'aminim lasted until the 20th century, even now. Just a few years ago, I wrote an article for The Forward about Shabbetai Zevi's house, one of his houses in Izmir in Turkey, which was about to be destroyed, and a group of descendants of Ma'aminim, of Sabbateans, actually saved it. It's now actually a museum. My article played a small role, but very small, in that happening. In fact, in the late 19th century, many Ma'aminim became the leaders of the Young Turks and brought about the advent of secular Turkey. A concept that's now under some threat, but which was dominant for many years. So another boundary or binary, the binary between Judaism and Islam. So I would even say that. So Sabbateanism as a mass movement fades away, but the impulse, the transformation of what it meant to do a Jewish ritual. This was the first time in which things that we attribute to Hasidism or to Neo-Hasidism, which we just did this morning, singing, dancing, clapping, this was not normative Jewish prayer in the 17th century. The first community that actually instituted this was the Sabbatean community because they enriched and infused their ritual life with stuff which we may now find very familiar, right? Energy, devotion, love, sublimated eros perhaps. It's not that there were, again, nothing wrong with maybe having a Sabbatean Friday night where there is a sexual ritual. It wasn't necessarily that. It was rather that the ritual itself was infused with this powerful love and yearning, which again borrowed from Sufism, also borrowed, Shabbetai Zevi's kind of favorite song was a Judaization of a secular love song, Melizelda, which was simultaneously sung to a female entity, so right to the Shekhinah in the Sabbatean frame, but also to Shabbatai themselves, right, who embodied that feminine aspect. So it's a hymn to the goddess, but also a hymn to the Messiah who embodies the goddess. So that love and that yearning was kind of successfully domesticated by the genius of the Baal Shem Tov into Hasidic prayer, Hasidic ecstatic prayer, and that filtered down. There's a nice chart on the last page of your Siddur of like the many roots of Jewish renewal. I was happy Sabbateanism actually is on that chart. It filters down even to us today. So I want to suggest that when we daven, when we pray, or when we're singing in an ecstatic mode, when what we want from our Jewish ritual is an elevated Jewish experience. That'd be nice to name a synagogue after that. Elevated, something, Romamu, right? That is in a lineage back through Jewish renewal and the Neo-Hasidim to Hasidism, and from Hasidism to the Sabbatian movement. So I want to suggest on this Pride Shabbat that this is not a kind of errant, strange deviation from Jewish history, but part of Jewish history that has been suppressed, right? He was a failed Messiah. He didn't win, right? The sect mostly died out and became a kind of underground sect. And yet, I see them as, in some ways, our foreparents. Last thing I want to say, and then we'll have time for comments and questions, is that Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, founder of Jewish Renewal, gave an amazing speech, a tiny bit of which is excerpted on the source sheet. It was published first as Renewal is Not Heresy, which is an ironic title because it's all about how renewal is heresy, and that's a good thing. And then was republished. You can get it now online, the whole text under a much less attractive title called Renewal is Judaism Now. I'll leave it at that. And in that text, I'm going to break my promise and read just a tiny bit. What is it that makes prayer so exciting? It's that same kind of urge. He's talking about eros and love, a longing and yearning for the divine beloved. Since the object of longing in Hasidism could no longer be a physical beloved, the object of the longing gets sublimated. Needing to put that longing someplace, it gets, sorry, I lost my own place. It gets invested in the messianic. Both the later Sabbateans and the Baal Shem Tov redefined what Jewish messianism even was, away from a historical process and into the moment of prayer itself. Moshe Idel, Sholem actually once called this the neutralization of messianism. Moshe Idel, another Kabbalah scholar, says this isn't neutralization. This is just a different kind of messianism. The Hasidim said that in your prayer, if your prayer rises up enough, you can experience the world to come in that moment, in that spiritual, eros-suffused, ecstatic moment. And this, again, is something that's had a powerful impact on my life and on the lives of many of us in this room. So that's a little bit of a reclaiming, perhaps, of a part of Jewish history that often gets left on the shelf. I was happy to see, I was just sitting there and I was like, I'm pretty sure that's the Shabbetai Zevi book. And I'm happy to say more about that or hear your comments, thoughts, and feelings. Shabbat Shalom, part 1. Rabbi Diane said we have a few minutes for Q&A, and I'll repeat the question for the Zoom folks. A question about the Parsha. All right, I'm on the spot. Maybe. I have reserved the right to not, I reserve the right to punt. Yeah. I mean, the Torah's right here. We should, you know.
So in this Parsha, God gets mad at us for not fully appreciating that God took us out of Egypt and out of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
But what they don't talk about is that God also brought us into slavery. And I was wondering, since you're very interested in Shabbetai Zevi, like, what you think, why you think that might be, or what are they meaning by that? Maybe that's a terrible question.
No, I love that question. I'll summarize it so you don't have to repeat it. So the question was, in this Parsha, God is kind of a jilted lover and is annoyed that, you don't bring me flowers anymore. You don't sing me love songs. And Shabbetai Zevi sang a lot of love songs for God and the goddess. But and the question was kind of like, well, yeah, I mean, God took us out of slavery, but wasn't God also responsible for us getting into it in the first place? What's the question? I mean...
What do you think we're supposed to take?
Oh, what do we take from that? I mean, I think there's a profound teaching. Again, I can't draw it into Sabbateanism because one of their questions that they struggled with a lot was the origin of evil. It was the source of evil. And, the tradition has so many different possible answers. It's like a salad bar of theodicy. It's either, don't worry, it's all part of God's plan, or it's actually demonic, or it's the Sitra Achra, the other side of the divine, and it's yearning for integration. And Nathan of Gaza, who I mentioned before, wrote voluminously on this subject. For me, I come to that phrase that God is the Yotzer Or Vorei Choshech, the former of life and the creator of darkness. And I think that in any time, certainly in our own, reckoning with that reality is the great spiritual challenge. And yet I wonder how well the old theologies hold up with that. You know, if you're in year 100 of the slavery in Egypt and someone comes and says, don't worry, this is all part of God's plan. To me, in the 21st century, that doesn't land it doesn't, there's a resistance on my part to taking that on. And I would fall back on one of the other theodicies on the salad bar, that we have the capacity, we human beings clearly have the capacity to increase or decrease suffering. And something like that, yeah. Goddess is Neil Diamond, though. That's my takeaway from that question. Yep. Here comes a microphone.
How did thank you for that talk, it was very illuminating. It was very illuminating, thank you. How did these Sabbateans see the 613 commandments?
So many of them
pass
were
through?
explicitly abrogated, because the Messianic age was here. The metaphor that's used is that the Torah that we live under in the non-Messianic age is the Torah of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the two trees in the Garden of Eden. In the redemptive time, if we don't want to make it just Messianic, in the time of redemption, we would live under a different Torah, the Torah of the tree of life. And that one doesn't have as many of the restrictions. So the ethical commandments remain in place, right? They weren't killing people or stealing things. But most of the Ben Adam Lamakom, the ritual commandments, were seen as no longer valid. And again, I use this word antinomianism, which is a long word, but they had the same idea that Paul actually had in the New Testament, that davka, they didn't use the word davka, that davka, you should break the commandment to know that you're free from the commandment. Right, so for Paul, that came up in the context of circumcision and also of kashrut and of eating meals with Jews and non-Jews together. And he said in the New Testament, you should do these things, not get circumcised, not obey, because you should know that you're in the new brit, the covenant, right, with Christ, right? So it's an interesting question how much the Zohar and Jewish mysticism took from the Christian model, that the Messiah would represent the end of that period of law, because that's exactly what Christianity said. Certainly that was true. That's not Sabbatean, that's in the Zohar, and it's in subsequent Kabbalah. And so there's, believe it or not, this is great, there actually is a Ma'aminim cookbook that exists, including a recipe for boiling a kid in its mother's milk to davka break the literal commandment. And not live, right? You kill the animal, you shech the animal, and then you boil it in milk. And that was actually seen as, again, it's a little bit like, I don't know how many people have heard of the Treif banquet in the Reform movement. Anyone heard of this? The 19th century, one of the things that led to the creation of the conservative movement was the Reform movement. I think it was the rabbinical school graduation. Each item on the menu was treif in a different way. Oh, by the way, there's a restaurant in Williamsburg run by ex-Hasidim called Treif. So this is alive and well in 2024. So that was their view. The view, from a slightly more serious way I'll put it, is like, to really enter into that redemptive consciousness requires a kind of rupture, a kind of shift. And they want that shift to happen. They want to create the conditions where you realize that you're free and that liberation is true. And that you can experience it in this life, that it's not, one day something else will happen in history or something like that. That was, if I were to put it a little bit more seriously, I think that was kind of the nut of their spiritual practice. Probably last one, but Diane will tell me.
Thank you. I have a question. Since God created us,
oh my God, what are these questions? Well, I'm supposed to be like, tell me what happened in 1666.
Since God created us in the beginning, male and female, so in the beginning we were both one, right?
Right.
In the oneness.
Right.
So the question I have is, how do we find our other half, the real other half that we were in the beginning, which is really called twin flames or twin souls? Because I've studied a lot of this stuff, and I know a lot about it. I can have a real discussion with you privately on this.
This feels like a Jungian question.
But I'm not going to. But I really want to know if there's any teachings in the rabbinical teachings about twin souls or twin flames. Because we're all
I
looking,
mean,
we're all looking for our other half.
yeah, the Platonic myth, right, that was also in the play Hedwig and the Angry Inch, right, that we were sort of one side male, one side female, and we're cut in half. That myth gets repeated in the Talmudic literature. The conventional answer, if I'm being honest, is it's a very heteronormative answer. A man meets a woman, and now you've met your other half. That's not my favorite answer, but that's one of the answers. That I don't know if that metaphor that you mentioned, the twin flames. I'm not sure if I'm not familiar with that metaphor in the literature. But there are many other answers as well, right? So, for example, one century before Shabbetai Zevi, Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, the great compendium of Jewish law, also had a spiritual angelic guide, a Maggid. And one of the things the Maggid told Yosef Karo, he was channeling it, was that we all have, our souls may or may not, they didn't have the concept gender, but our souls may or may not match the sex of our bodies. And so we all have some of each. And so part of it is understanding that dynamic and seeing which are the parts to search to balance and to embrace, I would say. So that's I like that one personally more, but it's dealing with that same question. And again, I want to emphasize there is also not only are there non-binary configurations of this in Kabbalah, there's also agender ones, meaning there's masculine, feminine, quote unquote neuter, and that also appears as well. So the Sabbatean movement was working within a Kabbalistic context that already had the notion that the genders of our souls may not correspond with, we would say in the 21st century, our sex assigned at birth, and that was a spiritual gift, not a crisis, but a blessing. Shabbat shalom.